Well, I am so honored and delighted to speak with you today on a topic that is very near and dear to me. And if I heard it correctly, we're just talking about we're all talking these days about using generative AI both to advantage ourselves as coders, but also to help organizations. I'm here today to share a little bit about really the organizational view of how major organizations around the world are thinking about the use of generative AI code. And in particular, what they're looking to do is to understand how much GenAI code is used. And so that's what I mean when I talk about GenAI code transparency. It's knowing how much GenAI is used, where in the code, and how much, because there's some benefits and some risks depending on how it's used. So we'll go through this presentation. Really looking forward to hearing your questions at the end. But again, please feel free to jump in, and Simon will share them with me. A little bit about me. Some of you have at least heard of the programming language BASIC, which is what I learned a long time ago on a very, very, very slow computer, although it was fast at the time. I've had the great pleasure of serving governments, investors, and operating companies over the last 25 years on technology and strategy. For the last 7 years, I've led the company I founded, SEMA, which is built to make tech understandable to non-technical audiences. We saw a real gap. Technologists understand the code and can talk to each other, but when it comes to chief executive officers who are not technical or boards of directors, it's really important, I'd say, for individual careers, as well as you go up the career ladder, to be able to explain tech to those non-technical audiences. We started working on understanding GenAI code composition about a year ago, when two major clients of ours from our first product asked us to start building it. We're talking about product market fit. It's really an honor when your current clients ask you to build something new. But it also gives us a grounding in why this matters to them and what is it that matters to organizations about GenAI code transparency. And finally, a little about me. I have 3 great kids. We're a very arts and craftsy family. In the bottom right, this is a picture. You all know what sushi is, a tradition we've done for more than the last decade. We make candy sushi out of marshmallow peeps. They're really disgusting. I would not recommend eating them, but they're a lot of fun when marshmallow peeps are around. So let's jump in. We're going to talk about 3 questions today and answer them for you. So hopefully by the end of this, you could do a pretty good job explaining the answers to these 3 questions to anybody, technical or not technical. Question number 1, what is GenAI code transparency? We talked a little bit about it already, but I want to give you some nuance. Question number 2, why should I, as an engineer, care about GenAI code transparency? And then question number 3, how does it work? I bet many of you are already thinking about that, and you've seen discussions of the accuracy or lack thereof of detecting GenAI human writing versus GenAI human language writing versus human language writing. Thankfully, it's a little bit easier on the code side, but we're engineers here, so we'll talk about the how. Simon, just a quick check because I can't see you. Is this the right pace? Am I still sounding okay?
Perfect, and your pace is all right.
Perfect. Well, let's get in. Part 1. Even before I do that, part 0, I want to make it incredibly clear how supportive GenAI SEMA is of using GenAI code, coding tools, whether it's ChatGPT or Copilot. Some tiers of those tools are better in certain circumstances. If you're using it in a corporate setting, you really want to make sure you're using an enterprise grade level of it. But basically, we think there are two categories of reasons why we like GenAI code usage. One is it's good for developers. The second is it's good for overall engineering productivity, so for the organization benefits as well. And I know almost all of you have tried it. If not, I really encourage you immediately to start playing with it because it is the future of coding. And not just for that sake, but as folks who use it, they will tell you it helps avoid mundane work. It helps experiment faster. It enables you to have a real-time code reviewer who's not always going to be right, but at least there with you as you are coding. So the overall satisfaction is that it's much higher for coders using GenAI than without. It also substantially increases engineering productivity. We estimate there's probably a 40 times return on relative to the cost of buying a license to the benefits for the organization. So if you're working in an organization and they have not bought you an enterprise license, please send them this presentation because it is really good for the business, and the business should want you to be using a really high grade tool, maybe even more than one tool. Some companies buy licenses for more than one product so that developers can use them in different circumstances. So we are big fans of GenAI coding tools, and I wanted to be very clear about that. We have become experts in this newer field of AI code transparency. So what do we mean by that? There's really two parts. Number one, it's distinguishing code that originated with GenAI tools. They could be generic like ChatGPT or specific to coding like GitHub Copilot versus originated not GenAI. So everything else that didn't come as a result of a prompt is not GenAI. It could be written by the team. It could be open source code. It could be auto-generated code that came from a scaffolding or other framework code that wasn't human written, but it didn't come out of a prompt. And the real question that is on people's minds is, did it come out of a prompt or not? Which is why it's GenAI or not GenAI. I'll come back and talk about auto-generated at the end because that's one of the things that makes it hard to detect easily. Second part is once we've decided it's GenAI, we want to distinguish between GenAI that was unmodified, that came straight from the prompt. We call that pure GenAI, or did it get modified by developers after the fact? And we call that blended. And as we're going to see through this presentation, blended code is much safer than pure GenAI code. I'm going to pause for a second. You've probably almost all of you have tried generative AI coding tools. I hope you have. Maybe some of you are skeptical, and maybe some of you are skeptical because you're wondering if you really are a real developer if you're using a tool like this. We've certainly heard that as we've interviewed coders around the world. I don't know, am I cheating if I do this or not? And when people think that, there's nothing wrong with that, and frankly, it's to wonder about that. And we applaud you thinking about what does it mean to really respect your craft. I have a very simple answer. Replace the phrase GenAI code with open source and see what your answer is. So let's go back to this. Does using open source code increase developer job satisfaction? I'm sure you would say yes. The idea of rebuilding frameworks or rebuilding modules or libraries that already exist, when you know there's a simpler answer, it's much more satisfying to use an open source answer instead. It also, if you think about it for a moment, open source makes developers a lot more productive in that you don't need to build the front end framework. You can just have one and then add your customization to it. So we know that open source is almost universally adopted. You're already using a tool that makes it easier for you to code and focus on the parts that only you can do. And there's such a value in that. That's true for open source, and it's true for GenAI code as well. So if anyone says, I don't know if it makes me if I'm not sure if I'm a real developer because I use it, ask to use open source, it's really the same thing. There is, however, one really big difference, which is why I wanted to bring this back up, between open source and GenAI code. as you hopefully know, if not a quick refresher, for open source code to be the safest, what you want to do in all situations, or almost all situations, is not modify it. You want to reference the most recent version. You want to keep up to date with the most recent version. One reason for that is the code's maintainability. Another reason is the security. Open source codes has security vulnerabilities that are publicly known called CVEs, and staying up to date with the most recent version helps you achieve those. Helps you fix, automatically fixes the errors, certainly the vast majority of them, the security errors. And so for open source code, you do not want to blend it. You want it to stay pure. GenAI code is the opposite for reasons we're going to get to. And so you want to think about GenAI code similar to open source, with the exception that you really want to make it yours. You want to blend it because it becomes safer for a variety of reasons. Okay, so we've talked about what is GenAI Code Transparency. I'll just give you a really simple example from our own company. This is, so we have two products. The newest product is AI Code Monitor, which detects the amount of GenAI code in a code base. So this is the application it's from. Scoop is our first product, which has been around for 7 years and it's a code scanning tool. It's the right way to think about it. We also group some of our code into, it's still part of Scoop, but we haven't modified it in the last 3 months. And so this is looking at sort of an application level. This is an application, and these are two parts of the application. How much GenAI is there? If I use this numbers in the sentence from the AI Code Monitor, 18% of the code originated with GenAI. That means 1 minus 18 is 82. 82% did not originate with GenAI. And then of that 18%, at least 8% is blended, and meaning it was modified at least somewhat. We know that as a minimum. Up to 10% is unmodified. For Scoop, our older product, and I should say this is all code all time, there's much less GenAI code in it. 98% of it was generated without any GenAI. Now, you might already be coming to a conclusion about whether one of these is better or worse. It's okay to be naturally curious. At CIMA, we love, we build code metrics for a living. We love asking questions, but we really try to be curious before we're judgmental, because code is a craft. It's so contextual to know what is the right answer in any one circumstance, and there may be extenuating circumstances before you can come to a conclusion. So we like to ask questions rather than judge. And so a question here could be, is there a good reason to have a lot more GenAI code in the AI Code Monitor than in Scoop, our first product? And if I could do a poll, I'd see if any of you can think of a compelling reason. But since I can't, I'll just tell you, there is definitely a good reason. And that reason is the AI Code Monitor has been 100% created in the last year. And in the last year, GenAI coding tools have been available. By contrast, Scoop is a very stable product. Almost all of it was built before GenAI tools became around, and so most of it didn't have an opportunity to have GenAI in it. And so there's always a story about data, whether it's GenAI code or not. And so we lead with inquiry first, and I really encourage you to do that as you think about data about code. So we've covered what is GenAI Code Transparency, our first question. Second question, why should I care? And I'm going to say to you, you may or may not care yet, but the organizations you're a part of and organizations you might be working for today or might be working for in the future, many of them already care. And I know you'll remember this conversation. In the next 6 to 24 months, everyone will care about knowing how much GenAI is in the code base. So consider yourself on the cutting edge by being here for this presentation. I'm going to start this section with a news story that came out last Friday. So Axios is a major tech publication in the United States with a global reach. When AI code, produced code, goes bad, the same generative AI tools can produce flawed, potentially dangerous code. It matters, of course, because generative AI code is touching so much. So it's beginning to seep into the consciousness that while it's an incredibly good idea to be using Gen AI for coding, it also comes with some risks. This article, in fact, if you read it, points out 2 of them. There's really 5 categories of risks. And all 5 of those risks are reasons to know the composition. Because if you know how much Gen AI code is used and where it's used, you're then more likely to be able to address it. The 5 are the quality of the code. So Gen AI code may be lower quality, for example, because it's hallucinating or not giving appropriate context. Second, Gen AI code comes with security bugs. By the way, all code comes with security bugs. There's nothing against that. You just need to take precautions to find them and address them. Not using, so here's a risk, and this is again from the organizational perspective, but we would say if developers aren't using Gen AI enough, they're missing out on opportunities for greater job satisfaction and for organizational productivity. Again, imagine if developers weren't using open source and how much less fun their work would be. So measuring it helps make sure that we're getting to the right level of developer productivity. The fourth risk is that some uses of generative AI at work, code or otherwise, create some intellectual property risk. And like I said earlier, it is a must-have if you work for a business, for that business to give you an enterprise-grade license. Almost all of the Gen AI products have one, but you need it to protect the organization's code, because if you're not using an enterprise-grade tier, your code can be used as part of training data, and so you're basically giving away organization secrets. So please, if your company hasn't approved a license, send them to me and I will explain why it's just a must-have for the safety of the business. We don't care which tool. It just has to be a tool with the right protections. The last risk of the 5 is something we call exit risk. And so that exit risk refers to generative AI code being a risk when someone's trying to sell the business or take investment in the business. And so the process of looking at the code during a sale or potential investment is called technical due diligence. And leading investors around the world are already looking at how much Gen AI code is in the code base. And under certain circumstances, it could be harder to sell the business. So that is a very, very, very high stakes decision for the owners and investors of a company. And so if as Gen AI code composition becomes part of the due diligence process, it becomes even more important to understand it along the way, how much your composition is. So those are the 5 categories of reasons. You're now you're among the experts on Earth, because this is such a new field. Even a fancy article, fancy publication like Axios only thought about 2 of the 5. You now know all 5 reasons. Remember at the beginning when we talked about the big difference between open source and Gen AI code is that for open source you do not want to blend. For Gen AI you do. I'm just going to say this briefly because I bet getting to questions is more fun. But basically, every risk is reduced by developers taking the code coming out of the prompt and customizing it, modifying it for the circumstances, making sure it's correct, putting it through security gates. And I think we're just talking about this quality gates right in the previous session. We want you to use it. If it's up to us, we want you to use it, but Gen AI, but we want you to make it yours and really make sure it is correct, secure, contextual. Lastly, just a little bit, and then we'll go to questions because I know it's always more fun to have the discussion. Some people may wonder, how on earth do you detect Gen AI code? Just in case the segue wasn't clear, I talked a little bit about detecting human language use of GenAI code. So plagiarism detectors, you think about that, that refers to folks passing off work as their own. And there are now plagiarism detectors that are looking for, is this paper for school, was it written by a GenAI tool or was it written by a human? Plagiarism, another way of saying that, is GenAI detection of human languages. And what SEMA is doing, and folks in this space are doing, is GenAI detection for computer languages. When you say plagiarism, you're looking for it because you don't want it there. And so the goal, of course, in the academic settings is to not use GenAI where it's not approved. In this context, there are a few circumstances where GenAI should not be used. And so the detection is about not using it. It's all based only on company policy. Sometimes companies say, we just don't want this part of the code to be using it. But the vast majority, to be using GenAI, but the vast majority of situations involve, it is appropriate to use it, but how much is it used and how much is it blended are the really important parts. In order to detect GenAI code, so just a little bit of our secret sauce, we have an AI model that is a deep learning model that is trained on GenAI code and not GenAI code to create predictions about whether the next token is going to be GenAI or not. We then add to it a blending calculator to decide if certain code was modified by developers or not. And again, I'll say just a little bit about this. In order to detect GenAI code, to use a detection engine, you can't just feed the whole thing in as an entirety and say, is there GenAI in it or not? I guess you could, but it's not interesting to say, if you think about a 100,000 line code base, yes, no, was there GenAI in it? That's not so useful. You want it to be as a granular unit as possible while still being able to have an accurate detection. And so that process is called chunking. There's an art and science to getting the code that's being evaluated just the right size. That's what chunking is about. The way that we train the model is, you have GenAI code and not GenAI code. GenAI code we synthetically generated by feeding instructions into a GenAI tool and asking it for code, doing that at scale, obviously. And not GenAI code, we picked examples that came from before GenAI tools were in commonplace, so using slightly older code. Last thing I'll say about blending is that we have a very simplistic model today where we at least understand if there's been more than one commit. What's going to be coming in the years ahead is more and more sophisticated ways of measuring it, but we wanted to start somewhere. Two things, and then I will stop. Three things, and then I will stop. If you decide that you care as an organization about GenAI code composition, we think there's two more things that it's not enough to just look at it at a dashboard view. You have to make it easy. You have to make it more useful. One way to make it more useful is for developers to have GenAI code detection when they're doing code reviews. Almost all of you are familiar with seeing quality gates or security dates during the code review process. It's just a magical way for code to get better and coders to get better. And so GenAI detection code detection should also be at that stage. And then the other, because there's all these high stakes decisions like, am I going to pass diligence or not? There's this notion of attestation, which means humans going through and either agreeing with or overriding whatever the label was about GenAI to detect, to come up with a permanent record of how much GenAI is in the code. So you'll be hearing a lot about attestation, and you'll probably have to do it with some of your companies in the years ahead. Before I stop, there are several ways to learn more if you find this topic interesting. We have a whole bunch of blog posts. Simon, I'm sure you're going to post this as a PDF. So you can find the blog post, semasoftware.com. If you are an engineering manager or a CTO, engineering managers and up, we have AI advisory councils. Feel free to drop us a note and say if you're interested, free of course. And if you'd like to try it out, the AI Code Monitor that we saw today, if you use GitHub or Azure DevOps, we're offering 2-week trials.